Hello, this is Graham, and in this video, we're going to be looking at one of the biggest developments in counselling in recent years, cognitive behavioural therapy. From 250,000 years BP to about 10,000 years BP, in the Paleolithic era, our hunter-gatherer ancestors needed to outsmart their prey. They had to find ways of conserving energy in the winters, and they had to gently occupy themselves when they couldn't hunt. They therefore needed to be able to think strategically and be creative. In order to do so, they evolved bigger, more complex, and better oxygenated brains. This enabled us to solve more complicated problems, to become more social, to collaborate with one another, and to tackle bigger projects together. However, this was at a cost. All that thinking took time, and yet they themselves were under attack from predators and other clans who saw them as easy pickings. So they didn't just need to think rationally, they also had to think fast. Many people could be attributed with devising CBT, but Beck is probably the most credible. As a trainee analyst, Beck had been using some techniques developed by Alfred Adler a few years earlier and was already getting some flack from the psychoanalytic community because he was able to achieve results faster than established therapists. In-house politics were unfolding at the University of Pennsylvania over the appointment of a new head of department, and various people tried to embroil Beck in the controversy. He wanted nothing of it, and so he took an extended sabbatical from the university between 1960 and 1966 to concentrate on his private practice. In the spirit of the analytic movement, he made very detailed case studies of the clients seeing him and their progress. When reviewing those with depression, the one illness that the psychoanalytic community had difficulty working with, he observed that many of his patients didn't necessarily exhibit suppressed emotional responses, as in the Freudian models, but instead had consistent basic mistakes in their thinking. So where do these mistakes come from? So back to our Paleolithic ancestors. Processing information had quickly become key to our survival. But logic doesn't work that fast, especially if there are lots of options to our decision making. So we use shortcuts, things known as heuristics. A lot of these are based on what we call cognitive distortions or cognitive biases. The trouble is that what was really useful in the challenging world of cave dwellers isn't so helpful today. For example, when food is in short supply, binging on calorie-dense grub when we can get it makes sense. But in those days, we could be walking 15 to 20 miles every day in search of food and sometimes return empty-handed. Today, we often walk less than 2 miles a day and still can't resist bars of chocolate, sweet biscuits, or late-night bowls of muesli. When we lived in small groups and resources were hard to come by, we needed to recognise strangers quickly and not trust them until we knew them well. Today, this manifests itself in racism and xenophobia. Again, when we had limited food, we needed to conserve our energy. So our hunter-gatherer ancestors would shun exercise and take any opportunity they could to relax by the open fire, snuggled up in furs and so on. Today, we still like to snuggle up in our onesies by a fire, and many people struggle to drag themselves out to exercise. So we become overweight and our health suffers. Like most animals, we're genetically programmed to want to reproduce. We have little control over our need to produce the next clutch. This in itself is a problem to society, because the fundamental cause of climate change today is excessive human population. When you're living in such a tough environment, finding a robust, healthy mate is a challenge. So we evolved stereotypes of physical appearance to help us decide quickly. And if we don't think we have the optimum, then we adorn ourselves, we mask our imperfections, we showcase our best features. Today, of course, the need for a physically robust mate is much less important, and yet the stereotypes persist, and the cosmetics and beauty industries are worth billions. Focusing on depression, Beck found 6 common cognitive distortions. With the explosion of research into cognitive biases and over 300 formally identified, it's alarming to think that if he'd known so many, he would probably have never developed CBT. The 6 that he identified were selective abstraction, where someone makes a decision on the basis of just a bit of evidence rather than taking the whole picture into account; minimization, which is about favouring a negative possibility by playing down the importance of the positive ones; personalization, which is either taking personal responsibility for something that wasn't your fault or blaming someone else when it wasn't theirs; arbitrary inference, which is about drawing a conclusion when there's little or no evidence; magnification, which is blowing things out of proportion; and overgeneralization, making sweeping conclusions when there's little or no evidence. These days, while it's possible to become quite sophisticated in the use of CBT by identifying the associated thoughts behind each of the 300 or more cognitive biases, or even just the half a dozen that Beck identified, it's still very helpful to many clients to simply acknowledge that most distorted thinking takes the form of what Beck called automatic negative thoughts. The trouble with these distortions is that we get into a vicious circle. If something happens that makes me feel anxious, my negative thoughts want me to avoid it, so I act on those and do so, which means that I never get to do anything new, different, challenging, inspiring, or even fun. So my sense of depression gets worse. There are a number of different schemas, as they're called, for the application of CBT, but most of them cover the same steps. They begin by identifying the behaviour that's problematic, and then try and estimate how significant it is. We then determine what the feelings are that are associated with this behaviour. We identify and document the underlying thoughts. We take those and reconceptualise them. If we're working with someone else, we help them rewrite them in a more constructive way. We then help them to learn this new way of seeing them, revisit the process a few times, and finally follow up with an assessment of the emotions, their severity, and the behaviours, so that we can see that there has been an improvement. And this reinforces the change for the individual as well. Despite the initial focus on depression, in the United States today, all psychotherapists are now required to have a training in CBT. In the UK, NICE recommend it as the first treatment for most psychosocial disorders, from anxiety and depression to phobias, addictions, eating disorders, stress, and even schizophrenia. It's been widely tested, and it shows a significant improvement in symptoms in most cases. It can also be used alongside medication, and has been shown to prevent the onset of certain conditions, such as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's therefore used for what is known as critical incident debriefing. However, CBT is not a panacea. It doesn't work for everybody, and sometimes the underlying causes are not being remedied, and so they will re-emerge later.